A boot slammed the front door open so hard the hinges screamed. Two men in gray suits walked straight past the coffin flowers and into the living room. One of them started measuring the sofa. The other opened a briefcase on the kitchen table and spread out papers. Nobody knocked. Nobody said sorry. A moving truck backed up the driveway, beeping. Furniture went out the door, the recliner, the bookshelf, the china cabinet with the wedding plates still inside. An old man stood in the middle of it all, holding a dog's leash, watching strangers carry off 40 years of his life. His name was Elias Thorne. He had buried his wife that morning, and his own children had signed the orders. What did that old man find under the lodge floor that his children never knew was there? It was worth more than everything they took. Stay with me. Let me back up a few hours so you understand what kind of morning this was. It rained at the funeral, not hard, just enough to soak through a good coat and make everyone want to leave early. Cedar Hollow was that kind of town, small, quiet, the sort of place where the whole Main Street shows up when somebody's wife dies. And they did show up. The pews were full. Margaret Thorne had taught 4th grade in that town for 31 years, and half the people crying in the back had once been her students. Elias stood at the front in a suit that no longer fit him right. He'd lost weight in the last year watching her fade. His hands shook when he tried to speak, so he didn't speak much. He just said, "She was the best of us," and sat back down. That was the whole eulogy. Nobody minded, everybody understood. Now here's the thing about his 3 children. They came to the funeral. I want to be fair about that. Vincent, Diane, and Marcus all flew in. They sat in the front row in expensive black clothes and checked their phones during the hymns. And the second the last handful of dirt hit the casket, they were already talking numbers. Vincent was the oldest, a corporate lawyer down in Denver. He had a way of smiling that never reached his eyes, and he'd already brought a colleague, a man named Fisher who specialized in estates. Diane ran a real estate office in Phoenix and spoke about her mother's death the way you talk about a delayed flight. Inconvenient, something to get through. And Marcus, the youngest, the one Margaret had spoiled rotten, just went along with whatever the other 2 decided, as long as there was money in it for him. They didn't come back to the house for coffee. They came back with a truck. See, while Margaret was alive, she'd handled everything. The bank accounts, the bills, the paperwork. And a year before she died, when the cancer got bad and the medical costs started stacking up, the children had convinced her gently, lovingly over the phone to sign a few things. Powers of attorney, beneficiary changes. Just to make things simpler for Dad, Mom, so he doesn't have to worry. Margaret had trusted her kids. Of course she did. She'd raised them. She never told Elias. So when the lawyer, Fisher, spread those papers on the kitchen table that afternoon, Elias learned all of it at once. The house was in the children's names now. The savings, nearly $200,000, everything he and Margaret had put away over 40 years, had been moved into a trust that the 3 of them controlled. His name wasn't on any of it, not the deed, not the accounts, not even the truck in the driveway. "You understand, Dad," Vincent said, not looking up. "Mom wanted things handled responsibly. At your age, managing an estate this size, it's a burden. We're taking the burden off you." Elias stared at his son. "This is my house." "It's the family's house," Diane corrected, "and the families decided to sell it. They cleaned it out over 2 days. Ranger, the old chocolate lab, gray around the muzzle now, followed Elias from room to room, whining low as strangers unhooked pictures off the walls. Elias asked for one thing, just one, Margaret's wedding china. The plates with the little blue flowers around the rim, the ones she pulled out every Christmas and every anniversary for 40 years. Diane wrapped them in newspaper and put them in her own car. "These are worth something, Dad. You just break them." He didn't argue. He'd stopped arguing by then. Something in him had gone quiet, the way a house goes quiet after the power's cut. At the end, they handed him a single folder. Inside was a deed, the one thing they didn't want. A property their grandfather had left the family 60 years back. A rundown fishing lodge on the shore of Silver Lake, 2 hours north, deep in the Montana pines. No road to speak of. No electricity. The county had it assessed at $4,000, and Vincent had laughed when he read that number out loud. "There's your inheritance, Dad," he said, dropping the folder on the empty kitchen counter. "Grandpa's fishing shack, all yours. God knows nobody else wants it." They left before dark. No hugs. Marcus gave a little wave from the car window. And just like that, 78 years old, a widower of one day, Elias Thorne stood in an empty house that wasn't his, holding a folder for a shack he'd seen maybe twice in his life, with a dog leaning against his leg. He loaded the rowboat, the old wooden one from the garage, the only thing they hadn't bothered to take, onto the roof of his rusted station wagon. He put Ranger in the passenger seat. And the next morning, he drove north into the mountains, because he had nowhere else in the world to go. The lodge was worse than he remembered, and better too. The road ran out 3 miles short, so Elias parked and walked the rest, carrying what he could, Ranger trotting ahead through the pines like he'd lived there all his life. And then the trees opened up and there it was. Silver Lake. Flat and still and silver, just like the name, ringed all the way around by dark timber and not one other building in sight. His grandfather's lodge sat right on the water. Log walls gone gray with age, a stone chimney, a porch that sagged on one side. Elias stood there a long time. He hadn't cried at the funeral. He hadn't cried when they took the house. But he stood on that shore with the lake wind in his face, and for a minute his eyes stung and he let them. Then he got to work because that's what you do. The first week was just survival. He swept out 60 years of dust and mouse nests. He found the old wood stove still solid, the iron cold but sound. He hauled water from the lake and boiled it. He fixed the sagging porch step with a hammer he found rusted to a nail. At night he slept under 2 wool blankets with Ranger curled against his back, and the loons out on the water made a sound so lonesome it was almost like company. Slowly, it started to feel less like a shack and more like a place. He caught trout off the dock in the evenings and fried them in a cast-iron pan. He split enough firewood to make his shoulders ache, and the ache felt good, felt like being alive instead of just waiting to stop. Ranger chased squirrels and swam after sticks and slept in the sun, and Elias found, to his own surprise, that the quiet up there wasn't empty. It was full. Full of his grandfather somehow. The old man's hands were in every notched log and hand-carved shelf. It was on the 9th day that the floorboard gave him trouble. He'd been feeding the stove when he noticed one plank in front of it rocked under his boot. Loose nail, he figured. He knelt down with a pry bar to fix it, and the whole board lifted clean out, longer than he'd expected, hinged almost like it was meant to come up. Underneath, in the dirt-tan gravel gap below the floor, sat a metal box, army green. Rusted at the corners, a padlock long since seized shut. Ranger came over and sniffed it and whined. Elias' heart was doing something it hadn't done in weeks. He broke the lock off with 2 hits of the pry bar and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather journal, his grandfather's handwriting cramped and careful. And beneath the journal, a thick envelope of yellowed documents folded in thirds and tied with string. And beneath that, wrapped in a flour sack, something heavy. Elias unwrapped it slowly. Coins, gold coins, 24 of them, maybe more, each one heavy as a bottle cap and shining like it had been minted yesterday. Double eagles, $20 gold pieces, the old kind from before Elias was even born. He sat down flat on the floor. He didn't understand yet what he was holding. He only knew his hands were shaking and Ranger had put his big gray head in his lap. That night by lamplight, he read the journal. His grandfather, Amos Thorne, had come to that lake as a young man in the 1930s. He'd built the lodge with his own hands, but he'd done something else too. Over the years, quietly, he'd bought up land. Not just the lodge lot, the whole shoreline. Section after section, cheap, back when nobody wanted mountain timber. And the deed in that envelope, the original, hand-drawn and county-stamped, showed it plain. Not $4,000 of worthless shack, but nearly 600 acres of prime, undeveloped lakefront wrapping the entire western shore of Silver Lake. Elias set the journal down. He looked out the dark window at the water he could no longer see. And a strange peace came over him, the first real peace in a year. He put the coins back in the box. He put a log in the stove. He made a cup of coffee and sat in the one good chair with Ranger at his feet, and he thought, well, maybe I'll just live out my days here after all. Quiet, forgotten, nobody bothering me. He blew on the coffee and smiled a small smile. For the first time since Margaret died, he felt safe. He should not have felt safe. The sound of an engine came up through the trees on the 11th morning. Not the rattle of Elias' old wagon, something bigger. A black SUV, brand new, grinding up the abandoned road as far as it could go, then stopping. 2 doors opened. Vincent stepped out in hiking boots that had never seen dirt. And right behind him came Diane, and behind her, the lawyer, Fisher, with a leather satchel under his arm. Ranger stood up on the porch and started to bark. They didn't come to make peace. I want to be clear about that. They came because Vincent had done what lawyers do. He'd gone digging. A development company out of Bozeman had been quietly buying lakefront in that part of Montana, building luxury cabins, selling them for a fortune to people from the cities. And when Vincent pulled the county records to close out his grandfather's worthless shack, he found the same thing Elias found in that envelope. 600 acres, the entire western shore, worth not $4,000 but somewhere north of $9 million, and it was in Elias' name. Only Elias' name. Because it was the one asset old enough that the children's paperwork had never touched it. Their mother's power of attorney, their trusts, their beneficiary forms, none of it covered a deed from 1961 that they hadn't even known existed. So now the story changed. It wasn't about pride anymore. It wasn't about a grieving man and some furniture. Vincent stood on that porch with a folder of his own, and what he said turned the whole thing cold. "Dad, we need to talk about your competency." Elias didn't answer. Ranger kept barking until Elias put a hand on his head. "You're 78, Vincent went on in that smooth courtroom voice. "You're living alone in the woods with no power, no doctor, no phone. That's not safe, Dad. Any judge would agree. We've spoken to an attorney about a conservatorship. For your own protection, we'd manage your affairs." All of them, his eyes flicked just once toward the tree line and the water beyond it, including the land. There it was. They wanted to have him declared unfit, take control of him the way they'd taken control of Margaret. And this time it wasn't a couch and some plates. This time it was everything his grandfather had spent a lifetime building. Now, if you're still with me, and I hope you are, because this is where it turns, do me one small favor. Hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one, about the people everybody underestimated, only reach folks like you when you help them along. That's all it takes. Now let's get back to that porch, because Elias Thorne was about to stop being quiet. He looked at his son for a long moment. Then he said, "You drove 2 hours up a mountain to tell me I'm not safe, but you're not worried about me. You're worried about that." He nodded toward the lake. "You found out what it's worth." Vincent's smile flickered, just for a second, but Elias saw it. "It's about the family, Dad," Diane started. "Don't." Elias' voice was low, but it stopped her cold. "Don't you say the word family to me. You took your mother's china out of my hands 3 days after she died. You don't get to say that word." Fisher, the lawyer, stepped forward smoothly and opened his satchel. "Mr. Thorne, I have some documents. If you'll just review and sign, we can make this simple and dignified for everyone. A voluntary arrangement is always better than a court order." He held out a pen. Elias looked at it. And here's the thing they'd forgotten, the thing they'd never bothered to learn about their own father. Before he retired, before he was just Margaret's quiet husband, Elias Thorne had spent 30 years as a land surveyor for the state of Montana. He knew property law. He knew deeds and titles and county records better than any city lawyer in fancy boots, and he knew exactly what that pen would sign away. He did not take it. "I'll tell you what's going to happen," Elias said. "You're going to get in that truck and drive back down the mountain, and then you're going to hear from my lawyer, because I have one now." Vincent laughed, but it came out thin. "You don't have a lawyer, Dad. You have a dog and a rowboat." 2 weeks ago, that was true. Elias reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper of his own, a certified letter he'd mailed from the little town at the base of the mountain and gotten a receipt for. "That was before I found what your great-grandfather left in this lodge, and before I drove down to the county seat and had the original deed recorded, notarized, and filed. In my name, free and clear." He watched it land on their faces. "You can't take what's already locked up tight. You should know that, Vincent. You're the lawyer." The color went out of Vincent's face. Fisher slowly closed his satchel, but they weren't done. Not yet. Because desperate people do desperate things, and Vincent had one card left, and he played it ugly. "Fine," he said. "Then we'll challenge the deed itself. A hand-drawn survey from 1961, filed by a man with no lawyer of his own. We'll tie it up in court for years, Dad. You'll spend every dime you've got fighting it. You'll be dead before it clears." He leaned in close. "You don't have years. You don't have money. We do. Sign the arrangement and we'll take good care of you. Fight us and you'll die in this shack with nothing, exactly like Mom's estate said you should." And that was the moment the whole thing hung in the balance. An old man on a sagging porch. 3 grown children and a lawyer with $9 million in their eyes. The lake flat and silver behind them all. Then Ranger, who had wandered off the porch during the shouting, started barking down at the shoreline. Sharp, insistent, the kind of bark that means come here now. Elias walked past his children and down toward the water, and they followed because they didn't know what else to do. The dog had been digging. There at the base of the big split cedar where the shore curved, the tree Elias himself had carved his and Margaret's initials into as a young man, 40 years ago on a summer trip up to the lodge before the kids were even born. Ranger had dug down a foot into the sandy soil at its roots and his paws had struck metal. Elias got down on his knees in the dirt. He dug with his bare hands, and he pulled up a small, flat tin, a cookie tin, rusted but sealed. And painted on the lid, faded but readable, were little blue flowers. The same blue flowers from the wedding china. His breath caught. He knew that tin. He'd seen it in Margaret's hands 100 times. He pried the lid off right there on his knees in the sand with his children standing over him, and inside was a folded letter in his wife's handwriting, wrapped around a small brass key and a single sheet of legal paper stamped by a law office in Cedar Hollow. Elias unfolded the letter. His hands weren't steady anymore, and he read it out loud because he needed to hear her voice, even in his own throat. "My dear Eli," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've come to our lake and Ranger's done his job. I always said that dog was smarter than our children. God forgive me for it. You never knew this, but I found your grandfather's box years ago, the summer we came up here after your father passed. I found the coins and the deed, and I understood right away what it all meant. I didn't tell you, and I'm sorry for that. But I knew our children, Eli. I saw what they were becoming. I saw the way they looked at us near the end, not like parents, but like an inheritance they were waiting on. So I went to see a lawyer A real one, an honest one, Mr. Halloran in town. And 2 years ago I did something I never told a soul. I put your grandfather's land, all 600 acres, into a trust, an irrevocable one. It can never be sold, never be borrowed against, never be taken, not by a bank, not by a court, not by our own children. It belongs to you for as long as you live. And after you, it goes not to Vincent or Diane or Marcus, but to the town of Cedar Hollow, to be kept wild forever, with a scholarship in your grandfather's name for every child who ever wanted to see this lake. They already took the house, didn't they? And the money, I know they did. I'm sorry I couldn't stop that part, but I could stop this. The one thing that mattered, the one place that was ever really ours. The key in this tin opens Mr. Halloran's file. He has all of it. Call him. You were always the quiet one, Eli. People mistook it for weakness your whole life. But I knew better. I knew what you were holding under all that quiet. Go catch a trout. Kiss the dog. Live, my darling, I'll be at the lake. All my love, always, Margaret. Nobody on that shoreline said a word. The wind moved across the water. Ranger sat down in the sand next to the old cedar, panting, proud. Elias folded the letter along its old creases. He put it back in the tin with the brass key. Then he stood up, and he turned to his children, and he was not shaking anymore. You hear that? He said softly. You lost this before you ever drove up here. Your mother beat you 2 years ago, and she did it without raising her voice, and none of you ever noticed. Because you never once thought the quiet people in your life might be smarter than you. Vincent opened his mouth. Fisher put a hand on his arm and shook his head. There was nothing left to sign, nothing left to challenge. An irrevocable trust, filed and sealed by a living lawyer with the paperwork to prove it, is a door that does not open. Even Vincent knew that, especially Vincent. Diane started to cry, not out of grief, Elias understood, but out of losing. Marcus just stared at the ground. Get off my land, Elias said, and this time nobody argued. They walked back up through the pines to the black SUV. No goodbyes. Diane looked back once, and for just a second Elias thought he saw something real move across her face, something like shame. But then she got in the truck and pulled the door shut, and the engine started and they were gone, grinding back down the mountain road, smaller and smaller, until the trees swallowed the sound. Elias stood on the shore of Silver Lake with his grandfather's gold in a box up in the lodge, and his wife's letter in a tin in his hands, and his dog leaning warm against his leg. And then, finally, 10 days after he'd buried her, Elias Thorne sat down in the sand and wept. Not the way you weep when everything's lost, the other way. The way you weep when you finally understand you were loved more than you ever knew. He stayed at the lake. Of course he stayed. Where else would a man go after finding out he'd been home the whole time? He called Mr. Halloran that week, drove down to the little office in Cedar Hollow and sat across from the kind old lawyer who'd kept Margaret's secret for 2 years. Everything was exactly as she'd written it. The trust was solid as the mountain itself. The land could not be touched. Elias signed the few papers that were actually his to sign, and Halloran shook his hand and said, "She was a remarkable woman, your wife. She came in here that day and told me, I need to protect my husband from my own children. I never forgot it." Elias sold 6 of the gold coins, just 6, and it was more than enough. He didn't need much. He had the lake. But he ran power up to the lodge that autumn, a small line, enough for a lamp and a hot plate and a little heater for the cold nights. He fixed the porch properly this time, the whole thing, and built a new dock that didn't wobble. He bought a good chair and set it by the window that faced the water, and he read his grandfather's journal cover to cover twice. He never heard from Vincent again. Diane sent a card the following Christmas, just a card, no letter, the word Dad and her name and nothing else. Elias kept it on the mantel. He didn't know if that made him a fool. maybe. But she was still his girl once before the money got into her. He kept it up there next to the tin. Marcus called one time, late one night, drunk maybe, and said, "I'm sorry, Dad." And Elias, who had every right in the world to hang up, just said, "I know, son. It's all right. Take care of yourself." And that was the last he heard from any of them. He found he could carry it. The forgiving didn't cost him anything he needed. He wasn't holding onto the anger, and it turned out the anger had been the heaviest thing of all. Word got around Cedar Hollow about the trust, about the scholarship in old Amos Thorne's name, about the 600 acres of wild lakeshore that would stay wild forever, that no developer would ever carve into cabins, that any kid in that town could hike out to and fish and swim and camp on for free for the rest of time. People started to look at the quiet old man differently when he came into town for supplies. Not with pity, with something closer to respect. And here's a thing I didn't expect to tell you, but it's true. He wasn't lonely. He thought he would be. But those first children came the very next summer, 2 boys, 12 years old, sent up by the school with permission to see the famous lake. Elias taught them to bait a hook and read the water and sit still long enough to catch something. He grilled their trout on the dock. He told them about his grandfather building the lodge log by log, and about a 4th grade teacher named Margaret who loved this place so much she found a way to give it to them. More came the summer after that. And the one after that. Elias fixed up the old bunkroom so kids could stay over. Ranger grew too old to swim, so he'd just lie on the warm boards and let the children scratch his belly, and he was happy. Every dog should be so lucky as to end up on a lake with children. Ranger passed on a soft morning in the fall, 3 years after they'd first walked out of those trees together. Elias buried him at the base of the split cedar, right where he dug up Margaret's tin, right under the initials carved into the bark 40 years before. He sat with the old dog a long while. "Good boy," he said. "You found her for me. You were always the smartest one." Then he planted a little cedar sapling over the grave, so something would grow. Elias Thorne lived 9 more years at the lodge on Silver Lake, nearly 90 and sharp to the end. He died in the good chair by the window in the winter, with the lake frozen white and still outside the glass and Margaret's letter folded in his shirt pocket, the way he'd carried it every single day. The town found him 2 days later, peaceful, a cup of coffee gone cold on the sill. They read his grandfather's journal at the service, and they read a little of Margaret's letter too, the part about the quiet people, and there wasn't a dry eye in the church where she'd once taught. His children came. All 3 of them, older now, quieter now, standing at the back like they didn't quite have the right to a front pew. And maybe they didn't, but nobody turned them away. That wasn't how Elias would have wanted it. The lodge is still there. It belongs to the town, held in trust, kept exactly as he left it. There's a plaque by the door with 3 names on it, Amos, Margaret, and Elias, and every summer the children still come, and they still catch trout off that dock. And if you ask any one of them who the lodge belongs to, they'll tell you it belongs to everybody now. You remember how this started. Strangers carrying a man's whole life out the front door while he stood there holding a leash. His children thought they'd won that day. They took the house and the money and the wedding china, and they drove off laughing about a worthless fishing shack. But the quiet man kept the lake. He kept his grandfather's gold and his wife's last secret and his good old dog and every child who ever came to fish thereafter. He kept the only things that were ever really worth keeping. So the next time you see somebody the world's decided is finished, some quiet old man in a coat that doesn't fit, standing in the middle of his own emptied-out house, you remember Elias Thorne. You remember what was waiting under that floorboard, and you think twice about who really won.